go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dan Shapiro. I'm one of the co-advisors for the Yakima Valley College Climate and Environment Club. Tonight, we're going to have my co-advisor, Hector Saez-Nunez, say a little bit about a land acknowledgement. And then our colleague, Susie Smaglick, will introduce our speaker for this evening. So let's see. Let me give Hector a nice view here. And Hector, go ahead.
We acknowledge that this event convenes on the traditional homelands of the Yakima Nation, along with the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge of these indigenous people. We would like to pay respect to the Yakima Nation and its elders, past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge the important role the Yakima Nation continues to play in the Yakima Valley. Thank you.
Thank you. Suki?
All right. Hi there. Yeah, so as Dan said, this presentation is sponsored by the YVC Climate and Environment Club, and it's actually a club that's open to the community. So if you're interested, we meet every Tuesdays at 12:30 in Zoom, and you can get more information from Dan, and you can or put your name in the chat later. So I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Kirsten Kapp, Master of Science. And Kirsten was a former colleague of mine at Central Wyoming College, and she used to track grizzlies, but now she works in microplastics. So quite a journey of scale we have here. Kirsten teaches anatomy, physiology, general biology at the Jackson Hole campus of CWC, and she's a wicked outdoor enthusiast. You can talk to her about that later. She's been mentoring undergraduate research projects for many years and brings to you tonight some of the results of her work with students that actually led her close to our neighborhood over here in the Columbia River. And when Kirsten's done with her presentation tonight, we'll have open time for questions. You can hold them until then, or you can put them in the chat as we go along. So welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you, Suki. It's funny you mentioned my past with grizzly bears. Yes, sometimes when I'm looking under the microscope for microscopic bits of garbage, I'm thinking, why am I not looking at a grizzly bear? But the common theme is garbage, and really comes down to mismanagement of our garbage, as you'll learn in my presentation. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll just make sure everybody can see it. Get up the presentation. Can you all see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yep.
Lovely. And you can hear me okay? Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest in my work. And actually what's become my passion over the years is microplastic pollution. So I like to start out my presentations by showing you a couple of different images and asking you a couple questions. And so what I'm going to do is show you 5 different images. And while you work through those images, I want you to think about what each one of them has in common. Okay. You can write in the chat if you want to add what you think they all have in common, or just words that come to mind. I'd love to see what your thoughts are. Okay, everybody ready?
Ready.
Okay, here's our first image. And if I went too fast, here's all 5 at once. So I see a couple of responses coming in on the chat. These are great. Water, remote, vastness, nature, peaceful. Excellent. Well, you can keep typing, but I'm going to move on here. So what each of these images have in common is, yes, water, nature, vastness, wilderness, with the exception perhaps of the one in the lower left. That's actually an agricultural field in Germany. But what they do have in common is that scientists have gone to every single one of these environments, collected environmental samples, and detected microplastics in every single one of them. And I like to show all of you this image because when I first began my research with microplastic pollution and would talk to my colleagues and friends about it here in the Intermountain West, they'd say, micro what? Or isn't that a problem in the ocean? And that was my first thought as well, is that marine debris and microplastics were really just a problem in our oceans. And what you'd often hear in the news at the time, and this is back in 2014, for example, you'd hear about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And that is an area of the ocean, the Pacific Gyre, that does have some floating kind of blobs of garbage, but it's not like a floating island of trash like the media kind of portrays it to be. Instead, what you see most often in a lot of our waterways, and specifically in the Pacific Gyre, are these floating pieces of confetti-like microplastics on the lower left. And so even though I did begin my study of microplastics in the ocean, I quickly realized that we needed to pay attention to our freshwater systems as well. So I wanted to start by first defining microplastics. You may have all heard of them, you might even know what they are, but let's go ahead and make sure we're all on the same page and know what we're talking about. So microplastics are small particles of plastic that are scientifically defined, that's like the greatest scientific consensus right now, to be less than 5 millimeters in size. So that's smaller than a grain of rice or a pencil eraser. And they come in all different shapes and sizes. So for example, here's a bunch of different types of microplastics on top of a ruler to give you the perspective of size. We have categories called fragments. So those are like shards of plastics. Picture a littered plastic bottle that over time will break down into smaller and smaller fragments. We have beads or granules, sometimes globules. Some of them are very round, like that black bead, and some of them are a little bit more irregular in shape, but they're still that round structure. We also have films. So these are real flexible fragments like bits of plastic bag. And then we also have microfibers. So these are two examples of fibers that actually I did find in my studies in the Columbia River. So they are a complex category of pollutants. There's not just one size fits all when we're talking about microplastics. So the next question is, where do they come from? We're learning more and more about the sources of microplastics. And in order to completely understand the potential impacts that they have on our environment, we need to know where they come from. So for example, you've probably all heard about this source, your wastewater treatment facility. So essentially anything that's plastic that's going down your drain, like clothing fibers from your washing machine, or microbeads that are in some exfoliant scrubs, for example. If you wash them down the sink, they end up, if you're hooked to city water, at the wastewater treatment facility. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the microbeads first. So there is a Microbead-Free Waters Act in place that did help eliminate some of these plastic beads that are purposely put into facial scrubs, for example, and body scrubs as an exfoliant. Those have been banned from products, but only from products that you wash off your face. So they still exist in sunscreens, for example. I don't know why, but they do. In some facial creams, like anti-wrinkle creams, I guess they fill in your wrinkles, some deodorants even. So they still do exist in some of these products. So that Microbeads-Free Water Act was an attempt to reduce the amount of microplastics from this source, but not completely effective at eliminating all of them. And then, of course, we have our clothing. So this has been in the news a lot lately as far as our washing machines being a major source of microfiber pollution to our waterways. And if we look at this series of images that a good friend and colleague of mine took under a microscope, you can see that your clothing comes in lots of different weave patterns. And so you can all look at the clothing you're wearing right now and see even the weave on it. If you're wearing a nice fuzzy warm fleece, you're going to see fibers that are woven in that third one from the top. That's an example of a fleece under the microscope. If you are wearing a cotton polyester blend t-shirt on the upper right, that's going to look like that. If you're a surfer and you wear a wetsuit, that really beautiful image down in the lower left, that's neoprene. And so your clothing comes in lots of different weaves and lots of different types of material: wool, cotton, polyester, acrylic, tencel, for example. Some are natural, some are man-made. And based on the weave, some of these clothings or garments can shed more than others when they're put into an agitated washing machine. And there's been a number of scientific studies now addressing this. So we have a really good idea of the fact that, yes, washing machines are a major source of microfiber pollution to our waterways. And although there are a number of different numbers floating around out there, this is reported from one study that approximately 700,000 fibers were shed from one garment during one wash. And so these 700,000 fibers are going to end up at the wastewater treatment facility plant, which was not designed to filter out these particles, right? Wastewater treatment facilities are designed to purify water that's either going to go back to the environment, right, or meets drinking water standards. And while they are really effective for the most part at filtering out 90% of them, or even 95%, it depends on the age and the structure of the facility. 95% of 700,000, right, that's one garment, is still a significant amount, right? 10% or 5% is still exiting and leaving the wastewater treatment facility and entering our waterways. So wastewater treatment is an important source, and there's a lot of focus on that right now as far as curbing the microplastics that are entering our waterways. A second source are industrial spills. So I'm going to throw up a couple pictures here. These are microplastic pellets, okay, known as resin pellets, or you may have heard of them as nurdles. And so if you work with a 3D printer, you may go and buy some of these bags of plastic pellets, right? Or if you buy a bean bag, you have a bean bag filled with these plastic pellets. And so thermoplastics that we use to pour into a mold, heat up to a temperature, melt, and form our plastic product. This is how we receive the virgin plastic to make that product. And so you can imagine, as we're shipping these pellets around the globe, accidents happen. Shipping containers can fall off ships. Where I'm from, in Vermont, we find a lot of these resin pellets in Lake Champlain and also along the railroad tracks, because back in the day when they were shipped in some of the railroad cars, those cars were not covered. And so we do see a lot of these plastic pellets in the environment there as well. Another source is runoff, right? So you've all seen this happen in a storm. You see a heavy storm and you're looking at the pavement and you're seeing all the garbage, all the trash going down the drain, okay? Now that seems a little bit obvious, but agricultural runoff is a little bit more difficult. There's a lot of research now focusing on agricultural runoff as a potential source of microplastics. And part of that is because we reuse our waste, which is a great recycling method to fertilize our crops, right? So we apply biosolids, or sludge, it's called, from our wastewater treatment facilities on agricultural fields. And unfortunately, that sludge contains microplastics. So when the microplastics are at the wastewater treatment facility, they settle out to the bottom, and then we dredge that up and we spray it on our crops. So we're still not entirely sure the extent of agricultural fields as a source into our rivers, and that might depend on what type of riparian buffer there is between the agricultural field and the waterway, but it is a potential source and perhaps a significant one. We do find a significant number of microfibers in agricultural soil samples, for example. Another source, mismanaged waste. So that's our litter. Okay, so that plastic bottle perhaps that you didn't bend over and pick up, right, can stay in the environment and be exposed to UV degradation or mechanical forces. And over time, it can break down into lots of different microplastic fragments or particles. So we're going to play another little game in the chat to keep you on your toes. I'm going to throw up this picture of that plastic soda bottle that perhaps you saw on the sidewalk. And if this is left in the environment, I want you to try to figure out how many jelly beans are in the jar. Only in this case, you're going to guesstimate how many microplastic particles, 1 millimeter in size, would result if this plastic bottle were never picked up. So go ahead in your chat, throw out some numbers. I'm curious to see what guesses we have coming through. Go higher. Ooh, 50,000 is a pretty good guess. Higher than 2,000, good guesses. All right, ready for the big reveal? Oops, let's see. There we go, 39,000. Now this was an approximate from a colleague of mine, again, Rachel Miller with the Rosalia Project. They sat down and did this based on the thickness of the soda bottle. And again, those 1 millimeter square. So this is a gross underestimate because microplastics, of course, are much smaller than 1 millimeter. And now we're learning more about nanoplastics. But it's a good exercise to think about the effect that just leaving that one soda bottle could actually have on the environment. Let's do it again, only this time with a plastic bag. So the plastic bag, we're talking about microplastic films. So go ahead and take a guess at how many microplastic films might result if this bag were never picked up. Ooh, now we're in the ballpark. Nice work. 426,000. That's a lot of microplastic films. So litter is an important source of microplastics. Finally, one that we're just starting to learn more about and has also kind of stolen some headlines is atmospheric deposition. And so we often refer to this as city dust. So microplastics can end up in the atmosphere, and then they can travel pretty far distances, of which we're still trying to decipher and tease out. But they can come from a number of different sources. In fact, roads are actually, and cars are actually one of the major contributors because they're mixing the air. They're making it more turbulent. And once those microplastics are in the air, they can get picked up by wind and brought to higher levels in the atmosphere and travel pretty far distances. And recent studies kind of grabbed the headlines from Dr. Janice Brainey out of Utah, where she looked at atmospheric deposition in wilderness areas and protected areas. And she found microplastics in both wet deposition, so falling out of the atmosphere with snow and rain, but also dry deposition, okay, when it's not raining or snowing and falling in those areas. And in just a headline that came across my feed this morning, they're also finding a significant amount of microplastic deposition in the Swiss Alps. So there's kind of a new field where people are starting to study using air quality meters to really get a good idea of what these patterns are. In my research, we're kind of shifting away from water a little bit, and we're starting to look at recreation as well. So a number of scientists have looked at just wearing our clothes in a room to see how much they're shed just by us moving around. And so students and I are starting to look at the recreational impacts to see if that's also a source when you're skinning in the snow, are microfibers being shed from your body at the same time. So now you know what microplastics are. Whoops. Now you know what microplastics are and where they come from. And I skipped ahead, but this is a picture actually of one of our snow samples from the town of Jackson, collected last spring. And you can see a number of potential microfibers. We have not analyzed these yet, but you can see lots of stuff in our snow. This is why I tell my child not to eat snow because I know what's in it. Not very good things. And now, of course, microplastics are entering that equation as well. So let's move on. We know what the sources are. We know what they are. And another important source that goes along with washing clothes are clothes dryers. And so for a long time, electric clothes dryers were left out of the equation. And a colleague of mine and I addressed this, gosh, I think it was 2 years ago now. The pandemic has kind of confused my clock, where we looked at clothes dryers because they are directly emitting dryer exhaust into the environment, but nobody had really addressed it yet in the research. And so we live in snowy environments, and snow for us was a perfect media because it cleans itself. You get a fresh snowfall, then you can run your dryer, run outside and collect surface snow samples and see if you can detect the fibers from the clothing that you dried in the snow. So that's essentially what we did. We used a hot pink 100% polyester fleece blanket so we could easily detect the fibers in our snow samples. This is an example of our plot here in the middle, number A, and that is Brooke Winslow, one of our helpers on this study, collecting her snow samples. And then to the right, you can see we collected 1 square foot surface samples about 1 inch thick, put them in glass jars, and then went back, filtered them, and analyzed them. And then, of course, in the lower bottom, you can see the vents. So we actually did this study in 2 different ways. We collected snow samples to see if we were finding microfibers on the snow, but then we also used a nylon mesh bag that we used very advanced techniques by simply duct taping it to the dryer vent, and then captured the lint that directly came out of the vent. So we are able to look at what's directly being emitted from our dryer vents into the environment. And as you can see from this figure down below, we found fibers in every single sample collected 5 feet, 10 feet, and then 30 feet out from our vent. And that's where we stopped collecting samples, but it doesn't mean that they didn't travel further, okay? So of course we did this in the snow, but our drone was only available in the summer. So that's why the image down below doesn't have snow in it. And you can see that the darker the color indicates the more microfibers we found. So we did find the majority of fibers were landing within 5 feet of the dryer vent. But what's interesting is how they are spreading out. And other results suggest, if you look at this figure down here on the lower or the bottom here, is that we have wind direction. And wind did also influence how many fibers we found at our various plots. And while we didn't address specifically wind, our results do suggest that this is something we should look at, or somebody should look at in greater detail, because microfibers can act like a sail when they get in the environment, okay, with the relatively flat surface, and they can travel pretty far distances, but we don't know how far yet. And what's exciting as our study has since really pushed other folks to look at this. So there's a study going on right now where they're going to apply some of our methods to a laundromat setting, which is pretty awesome. So we're very excited about this. And excited about hopefully bringing dryers to the conversation, right? When we're talking about engineering filters to put on washing machines, we really can't leave our dryers out of the equation. And then just to give you an idea of what we actually saw in our snow samples, on the upper right, you can see the hot pink fibers from the blanket, but you also see blue and black fibers as well, and yellow fibers. So we hypothesized that the fibers can also get hung up in the tubing coming from the dryer to the vent. And so once it's in that tubing, it might take a couple dry cycles for it actually to be emitted later. There are a few other studies where they're looking at the composition of fibers that are being emitted, whether it's cotton or linen or microplastics. But that depends really on who you are and the clothing you wear as a household. And so we really just looked at this particular polyester fibers. And while we did count cotton and all those other fibers we saw, we really focused on the microplastics for this study. So it's pretty exciting and interesting to note that dryers are also a really important source. Okay, so now I get to move on and think, well, what's the big deal, right? Okay, there's microplastics in the environment, who cares? Okay. Well, so far we know that about 220 different species at least have ingested microplastics, not macroplastics, right? Microplastics. So they range from the carp to bass to the albatross brown shrimp, of course, the turtle, oysters, even chickens. So now we're starting to look at terrestrial organisms as well. And to bring it back to freshwater, mayflies, and even caddisflies. This is a striking photo of a caddisfly using a microplastic particle to make its casing. So a number of different things potentially can happen when an organism ingests microplastics. If we think about the food chain and we look down here on the lower left at these smallest organisms, they can ingest microplastics. And some studies have shown that then the microplastics or the chemicals that were on that plastic particle are transferring up the food chain. This is something that we still need to really tease out all the details. However, when that organism is ingesting the plastic particle, it's not just simply plastic, right? So when you produce plastic, you put a number of different chemicals into that plastic. So for example, BPA is one that we've heard a lot about and can cause endocrine disruption. Plasticizers, UV resistant chemicals, fire retardants, antimicrobial chemicals as well. So a lot of other things go into that plastic that can be harmful to the organism. In addition to that, if there are already pollutants in the waterway where that microplastic ends up, research suggests that those pollutants, we call them legacy pollutants like lead, mercury, DDT, for example, other pesticides, can actually absorb or kind of coat that microplastic particle and can be yet another avenue for exposure for that organism when they ingest that microplastic particle. So this becomes really potentially challenging when we're trying to figure out what are the ecotoxicological effects, right, of ingesting that one microplastic particle. Is it just the polyethylene? Is it the fire retardant in the polyethylene? Is it the legacy pollutants that then adsorbed to that microplastic particle that's causing the harm? And so this is really what introduces the challenge of the field of microplastics and makes it really difficult to tease apart what those impacts are. And actually, the impacts are pretty widespread and varying. So first, I'm going to start with another graph, but I've kind of made it a little bit more fun for you. No offense to the author. It's a great graph. I love it. So let's tease apart what's going on because it's pretty busy. So down at the bottom, you have organisms. You have fish, crabs, lobsters, mollusks, worms, okay, rotifers, starfish, for example. Okay, so those different types of species. Above that, you see all these abbreviations. So PE, polyethylene, PS, polystyrene. Okay, so different types of plastic. On the top of the bars, you see numbers. So 14, means that 14 different studies, okay, looked at the effects of exposing or feeding polyethylene to a particular fish species. Okay, so that helps us figure out how many studies looked at that particular circumstance. And then the colors. The colors show all the different effects. So for example, we have mortality as an effect. We have a reproductive impact, physical effects. So I'm going to pull out just 3 of those so we can really kind of look at this a little bit more closely. So let's look at mortality. If we look at mortality, we can see that, wow, the crustaceans with a variety of different types of plastics, they did see higher rates of mortality in species exposed to those different plastics. And then you can look at 10 studies saw that, 29 studies looked at that, for example. But then when we look at fish and polyethylene, not nearly as many showed results of mortality. Okay, and then with mollusks, we don't see any, annelids, okay, so on and so forth. If we pull up the next one, our behavioral effects, we see it's more widespread. Now, of course, behavioral effects, right, can have a number of different instances. So for example, a slow predator-prey response, right? An organism doesn't swim as fast, is more lethargic, perhaps changes feeding behavior. Those are behavioral effects. So of course, they're more varied, but we did see a lot more behavioral effects kind of across the board. We'll look at one more, and those are the physical effects. So that would be stunted growth, for example. There have been studies that have looked at earthworms exposed to microplastics in soil and have showed them to have stunted growth. So that's an example of physical effect, in addition to perhaps an abrasion or a laceration during that ingestion process. So my point of showing you this graph is that microplastics really aren't just one pollutant. It's a category of a lot of different pollutants. And that's why it's not a black and white answer for how harmful microplastics can be. In fact, I'm going to show you a couple more figures. And so on the left, this is a great figure where they looked at all the literature and the studies that have looked at these potential impacts with different classifications. So for example, behavioral effect again, or I'm just scrolling down the list, community function, or gene expression, mortality. And you can see that the pink and the blue are almost mirrored. And what that means is that for as many studies where they found these negative effects, they also had the same number of studies that showed no effects at all. So the question just gets more and more complicated. And really that has to do with the figure on the right, because we're not just talking about one thing. And there's so much variability. So for example, how long an organism was exposed to a particular type of plastic might determine the impact. The particle size might determine the impact. Is a larger particle worse than a smaller particle, for example? The concentration. A lot of early studies were conducted in the lab at very unrealistic concentrations, much higher than what we find in the environment. And that just kind of argues why it's important to actually know if they're in their environment and at what concentrations. Then, of course, we have the different types of plastics. We have the different organisms, male, female, what age are they? And then even different species might be impacted more or less. So the question is really, really challenging when it comes to teasing out all of these. And I see some great questions coming up in the chat, and I'll be sure to refer back to them here at the end. So hold those thoughts. Those are great questions. Okay, so that said, we do know that there are organismal effects, and we're starting to look at ecosystem level impacts. So for example, microplastics can act as vectors. So here's a picture of a microplastic fragment that I found on the beach of Oregon after I had traveled the entire length of the Snake River and the Columbia looking for microplastics. Here I just picked up this fragment and look what's on it, a tiny little mollusk. So that mollusk can go wherever that plastic fragment goes. And that holds true for bacteria as well, and potentially pathogenic bacteria. And that's been shown to be kind of concerning in the oceans when microplastics are suddenly showing up at these remote areas, and on them they have particular types of bacteria. Studies are also starting to look more at the terrestrial environment, particularly soils and the physical chemical properties, so pH, water retention, for example. And if you alter the properties of soil, you're going to alter the impacts, the ecosystem level services that those soils provide, because our soils are so important. And along with that, if you're going to impact the soil microbiota, you're also going to impact the ecosystem. And then finally, what are the cumulative effects? So in some places, we're dealing with ocean acidification, right? Altering pH. We're dealing with rising temperatures. And then we're also dealing with microplastics. So what are these cumulative effects on organisms? And a number of different studies are starting to look at that as well. One notable that I'm quite excited for is one that's just starting in the experimental lakes region up in Canada, where they're experimenting with putting different amounts of microplastics in these experimental lakes to see how this really unfolds at a real ecosystem level. So that's pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what those results show us. So that said, right, now we know what microplastics are, where they come from, and the potential impacts to the ecosystem. So, right, the question we're all asking is, okay, how do our rivers fare? Okay, are they in the Columbia River? Are they in the Snake River? And so, as I mentioned before, I began my research actually in the ocean. I collected a bunch of Atlantic herring from the Gulf of Maine, and students and I here in Wyoming dissected them, primarily to look at whether or not the fish were ingesting microplastics. This was back in 2014, when kind of the effect on species research was really just beginning. But we couldn't help ourselves, right? Here we are dissecting these fish from the ocean, and we're thinking, well, what about our trout? What's going on in the Snake River? Now, of course, you can't just go out and catch a bunch of fish and dissect them and see if there's microplastics in the gut unless you actually know there's microplastics in the water source first. So that's really how this study came about. And back in 2016, we did travel the length of the Snake River from Yellowstone, the headwaters, and every 50 river miles, we collected water samples. So we did that all the way, you can see on the map, from the headwaters all along the Snake, and then the confluence of the Columbia out to the ocean. And our questions, of course, the first one was, are we going to find microplastics? Are they in the river? And at the time, only a handful of studies worldwide were looking at freshwater systems. So we didn't really have a good idea of whether or not microplastics were in lakes or rivers. We also thought, okay, well, are we going to see increasing numbers of them as we move downriver? Is there an accumulation of microplastics, right, as we move through populated areas? And related to that, do we find more microplastics in human populated areas? And then finally, are we going to be able to identify hotspots of plastic pollution? And so you can see down here on the bottom, I have a number. These are most of the sample sites in the Columbia. So some of them are pretty well frequented by human use, and some of them aren't. So at each site, we collected 2 samples. We use a plankton net, which was pretty standard back then for collecting microplastics in water samples. So you're really only collecting the surface water. Things have changed a little bit since then. For example, now I'm starting to use a pump to collect water samples throughout the water column. We used a 100 micron mesh net. So we couldn't sample for any microplastics smaller than 100 microns. And then we also did collect a grab sample. So that's about a 2-liter glass jar held way out from our bodies. And we were going to compare these techniques to see if by using different techniques, we still were able to identify the same hotspots. And of course, lots of fun happens in the field. Most of the work happens in the lab. So finding microplastics in an environmental sample is like looking for a needle in a haystack. You have to remove the hay. And so we subjected our samples to a digest. We used a hydrogen peroxide with a catalyst, which is a pretty common method across the field for digesting environmental samples. And then we separated the sample out by adding it to a supersaturated salt solution. So in this study, we used 2. We used sodium chloride and sodium iodide, because they have different densities. It's like swimming in the salt lake. You float more. And so plastics have varying densities. And if you can get a solution that is more dense than the plastic will float. And then you can just take off the top of that sample, and then you've separated out the sediment from the plastics. It makes your life a lot easier. And then, of course, we spent hours under the microscopes trying to identify microplastics. And we did find them. We found them, in fact, in the majority of our samples. So 75% of the grab samples contain microplastics and 93% of the net samples. And then all of the net samples in the Columbia, if we just look at the Columbia, and 6 out of the 7 grab samples showed microplastics in them. And here's some images of what we found. So a lot of fibers, a lot of films, a lot of fragments. And then can anybody guess what's in box D? That's the middle one on the left column. Anybody want to take a stab? It's not gold, although I really wish it was. Anybody want to take a guess at what that is? Sparkly. Glitter, yes. Nice work, Jared. Good. It is glitter. And I always like to point that out because you still see glitter in a lot of products, and yet it is plastic. Of course, now you can buy biodegradable glitter, which is wonderful. So a few more results that might be interesting to you. This colorful chart on the upper left there just shows the different types of microplastics we found. And you can see overwhelmingly, there's a lot of orange. And that holds true for all environmental studies these days. Fibers are the most prevalent form of microplastic pollution. We also did notice a correlation as we worked from the headwaters and downriver. So you can see in the upper right that the line does tilt up. So we did find more microplastics as we moved downriver, and we were able to identify hotspots. But I do want to highlight that it's really important when looking at our results that this was a snapshot study. So to really understand the microplastic load in a waterway, you need to sample not the surface, but also the mid-column, the bottom, at various widths along the whole water body. And you need to do it more than once. So ideally you would collect 3 samples at each site multiple times throughout the year. So you're sampling during a wet season and a dry season, for example. So it was my hope that this study would really kick off other studies where you could do more intensive surveying at some of these hotspots that we've recognized. And so on to those hotspots, I've got some pictures for you. So I'm looking at numbers 14 and 12, kind of right here in the middle of the map. And this is them. So Brownlee Reservoir, I don't know if you've heard it, it runs kind of the boundary there of Washington and Oregon. There are no homes really at all on the shores of the reservoir, and yet it was our greatest hotspot for microplastics, which is really interesting. It could be that in our sample, it just happened to be an area on a beach where perhaps a couple jugs of water were left behind and degraded over time. However, it's also really interesting that it's directly downriver from the Magic Valley, where we have very intense agriculture in Idaho. And the Brownlee Reservoir is also subject to harmful algal blooms, primarily due to nutrient runoff from those agricultural systems. So it'd be a pretty interesting study to look at correlations between nutrient pollution and microplastic pollution as a result of agriculture, especially when we have research now looking at agricultural runoff as a potential source of microplastics. And the other hotspot is Adrian, Oregon, down here on the lower left. So that's this triangle. And you can see it's really close to those agricultural fields as well. We also found mostly fibers in these, which potentially could show wastewater or biosolid application as well. And then finally, you might recognize this is just near Hood River, Cascade Locks, Oregon. And it notes again, recreational use could be another potential source to look at. On this particular day, there was a sailing regatta going on when I sampled. So that's an interesting observation to make as well. So how does this all compare to other rivers? Okay, if we just look at the Columbia River, we've got about 3 microplastic per 1,000 liters, which isn't that different if we just look at the Snake River, about 2.4. Okay, those numbers are both higher than what they were finding in the Ottawa River, lower than what they found in the Great Lakes tributaries, comparable to a study that was going on at the exact same time on the Hudson River. Although they sampled, I believe, every 3 miles, it's a much shorter river. We could really only handle every 50 river miles. They're very comparable, even though they sampled all fibers they found and we just looked at plastic fibers, they still are very comparable. And then down below in a study published in 2019, how does it compare to rivers around the world, compared to Germany, France, Switzerland, Austria? It's right in there, similar with those numbers. But again, I mentioned that microplastic sampling is challenging right now as well, because we don't have standard sampling protocols. Hopefully, a couple different working groups will come up with kind of a standard for people to follow, but it's really hard to compare results when we're all using different net sizes, for example. So under the sampling method, you can see all the different sizes. So in reality, our numbers would probably be lower compared to, for example, the 9 different rivers in the US if they sampled using a 100 micron mesh net because they would have collected more microplastics, if that makes sense. Okay, so there are microplastics in the Columbia River and in the Snake River. They are ubiquitous now. So pretty much everywhere you're going to look, you're going to find microplastics in one form or another. We do know that there are negative effects associated with exposure to microplastics. A lot of what we know are based on lab studies, but more and more studies are coming out where they're using more environmental concentrations or paralleling environmental concentrations. We do know a lot more about the sources, and by knowing the sources, we can try to reduce the emissions from that source. We know that plastic's not going away. It's far too valuable, right? Plastic is really important because it doesn't really make an immune response in your body. So you can use it for transplants. It's producing lighter vehicles for more fuel efficiency, for example. It's not going away, but we can be better at how we use it. And so while I did highlight there's still knowledge gaps, we still don't know everything. We don't know exactly the impacts that microplastics have on our environment, but that shouldn't be hindering solutions. There are a lot of wonderful solutions out there. So before I actually wrap up, I'm going to do another activity with you in the chat. And some of you probably have some great solutions for ways that you can reduce your use of plastic. So I would love for you to share those in the chat with everybody. And we'll use that as a way to introduce some of the other, or my favorite solutions before we open up the floor to questions. Buy in bulk, yes. Reusable grocery bags, awesome. Yes, line drying clothes. I'm sitting under my clothesline right now. Filters on washing machines. Don't buy bottled water, buy in glass. Excellent. Excellent. Well, here are some of my favorite solutions. Bowl covers. I love these bowl covers that you can put over your bowls instead of saran wrap. It's my favorite thing. Saran wrap and I don't get along anyway, but these bowl covers are much easier to use. I love these reusable gallon storage bags. They're fantastic and very durable. So using those instead of your plastic Ziplocs, which don't last very long, even when you wash them over and over again. Of course, buying in bulk, somebody suggested, and now they sell lots of different produce bags you can buy that are really light, so they don't affect the overall weight of the product you're buying. Christmas can be fun when you use fabric wrappings as well. I love giving gifts wrapped in fabric that you can just get at the thrift store. Reusable utensils as well. You don't need to buy a fancy bamboo utensil set that uses more resources. Just go to the thrift store and pick up some extra utensils and carry them around in your bag. These are my favorite silicone straws. They're very thick. They're great for smoothies that come apart. They're easy to clean and they're not cold on your mouth. And of course, lots of tea bags are made of plastic. So if you can buy teas in bulk, that's a great solution as well. And then some other ones that get to the washing machine, the Cora Ball. So if you don't own your own home or you live in a dorm and you go to the laundromat, a Cora Ball is a great start. This was designed by the co-author on the dryer study that I worked with, and it's designed actually after coral. And you can throw it into your washing machine and it actually attracts some of those microfibers that are shed. And in independent lab studies, has been known to be about 25% effective, which doesn't seem like a lot. But remember, when you're talking about 700,000 fibers per garment, that actually adds up quite a bit. If you do own your own home, you could install an aftermarket filter on your washing machine. There are some exciting studies going on right now in Canada where they're looking at if so many households installed these filters, how many microfibers would be trapped and not emitted into the waterways. So it's a pretty neat solution as well, as long as you're able and don't forget to clean out the filter, because you will need to do that as well. Well, I think that's all that I have for sharing my knowledge with you, but I want to open it up for questions. So as long as we can make one small change, then when I show you these images again, you won't see microplastics, but not because you can't see them, it's because they're not there. So before I open to questions, I need to thank a number of different people. First of all, my number one funder, Wyoming IMBRI. So I'm funded through a National Institute of Health grant. Also, Rachel Miller and Brooke Winslow, both colleagues that worked with me on the dryer study. And of course, my numerous students and undergraduate research assistants, most notably Ann Dalton, who's up here in the middle screen, very happy on top of a glacier, collecting snow and ice samples to analyze for microplastics that we are currently doing right now. So thank you so much. I hope that I helped spread awareness and maybe motivated you a little bit to make a change, but I'd love to go ahead and open everything up to questions. And I know there's a couple in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself. You don't need to use the chat to ask the questions.
Do you want to start with the chat questions? Do you want
Yeah,
me to read
I'm looking for it here. I think it was a human health one. Let's see, these are great. Here it is.
Roberto at 650 is the first question there.
Yeah. How do those contaminants affect human health? What is the effect in humans by consuming high quantity of contaminated fish? Yeah, that's a really good question. The human health questions are really, really important. And it really is center line. And unfortunately, I have to tell you, we don't know yet. So the first step in these toxicology studies, of course, is using animals in the lab. There are a number of studies that are kicking off now looking at human health and that link. There have been some correlative studies I can tell you about, most notably workers that lived close to clothing factories or textile factories. They were finding higher incidence of respiratory illness. So that comes from actually breathing in microplastics as opposed to ingesting microplastics. And so we do see that there is transport of small microplastics and the ability for them to then be taken up into human tissues. Another study that I actually haven't been able to spend too much attention to is one with irritable bowel syndrome. And so increased amounts of microplastics in certain subjects were more prone to irritable bowel syndrome in humans. And those are kind of the two most notable studies that I'm aware of, but it's a really important question. And I know a lot of studies in Europe have started looking at this, but the US is kind of lagging behind a little bit in that. Great question. Let's see. Ooh, how long does it take for microplastics to break down in the environment? That's a fantastic question, and it varies depending. And there are a lot of numbers out there. And I used to actually share that, 500 years for this, for cigarette butts, so on and so forth. But it's actually never really been studied. And so a couple different microplastic labs out there are now using specialized rooms to try to figure out, is it really 500 years? Because there's no way for us to know, because plastic hasn't been around for 500 years and neither have we. So it's a really interesting question. And it's another one where I don't have that exact answer for you. Earlier, you mentioned that microplastics in the atmosphere. Okay. Oh, yes. I know there are numbers, and you've caught me. I don't have them committed to memory. So it could be 250 kilometers, for example, but it could also be halfway around the globe. And that's what scientists are looking at and what they are finding. So probably similar perhaps maybe to black carbon. I'm not sure. I don't think anybody's done a comparative study yet, but it would be really interesting to look at both of those things together, both black carbon and microplastics. I know it was also suggested by scientists, not based on data so much, but that, as black carbon, we're looking at, okay, how does that accelerate snow melt? But are microplastics also a culprit in accelerating snow melt? And that's another interesting question to look at as well. see, I think there's a couple questions. Ooh, nanoplastics. So that's another really good question. So I believe this recent study in the Swiss Alps was looking specifically at nanoplastics, and they use mass spectrometry to do so. But up until this point, it's kind of one of those situations where technology has not yet caught up with our scientific questions. And so we don't really quite have the technology and those methods to really look at that. That's my understanding. But yes, at some point, right, we're going to have to start looking for smaller and smaller and smaller particles. And that's another reason why I kind of started us out by defining the size of microplastics, because as we learn more about them, we're learning that there's actually different size classifications. That's a good question. Are you seeing any other questions, Suki?
Yeah, there's a couple back up towards the beginning here. One is, are there concentrations near dams? So I think that means, like, are they more concentrated in dam areas?
That's my favorite question, because I had hoped to actually look at that. That was kind of the next stage of the study. But by looking every 50 river miles, you know, to try to be randomized in our approach, we couldn't actually look at that. However, studies in China have looked at that. And yes, dams are sinks for microplastic pollution. And there's also patterns of just where water slows that you see microplastics settling out to the bottom. So I was interested to see if our results could show any type of pattern where it spiked as you got closer to the dam and then kind of dropped back down after the dam, and then spiked again at the dam. But we didn't have quite enough samples to look at that. Yeah, but that's something that's been on my mind. I'd really like to look at that.
Yeah. There's another one about, is it possible that our drinking water contains all these microplastics, such as clothing fibers?
Yes, it is possible. And there are studies out there looking at that. Of course, it'll depend on your community, what level of wastewater treatment, you know, you have, if it's second tier, third tier, so on and so forth. And then well water versus wastewater, or sorry, city water. And then that takes me probably to the next question about groundwater. And that's another fantastic question. And there are folks that are currently looking at that, but it's not a widespread answered question in the field, and how far plastic particles percolate through the soil and what their behavior is. So you can see it's really a new field, which is so exciting. It's really been fun to watch science play out in real life, because it's moving so fast as well. It's been really exciting, and there's a lot of just questions that come up and questions you want to ask, and then somebody finally asks it and answers it in the publication. You get really excited. So it's a fun field to be in.
Yeah, there's one more way up at the top here, and then I see that there's some more that have come in. So this is referring to, I believe, your early slide where you're showing us the sources of microplastic. So which one of these affects the environment the most, and how might they affect ocean fauna?
The most impactful source, I would have to say wastewater treatment at this point. However, I'm going to kind of tag that on to atmospheric pollution based on what we know now about closed dryer emissions. And the reason why I'm picking that out is because microfibers are the most widespread microplastic particle in the environment. So if that's the most widespread, then the sources of microfibers are probably the most important sources to look at, but they're also the most difficult, right? Because it's too hard. I'm not a promoter of we should all wear wool and cotton. Cotton has its whole other host of environmental problems, right? And we still don't know about the dyes in these clothing that we use. But I am more for the clothing companies that are looking to change the weave of their fabric so that they're less susceptible to shedding. and that type of thing. And I am a proponent for repairing your clothing and not washing your clothes as much. We don't need to really wash our clothes, you know, if we wear it once. And so kind of those societal changes I'm a promoter for. But I would have to say, back to that question, that I would say it's wastewater treatment and then the atmospheric dust, just because of the fibers that are moving around in the atmosphere. And that's a harder one to, you know, to isolate and to reduce.
Mhm. It looks like there's one last question here, and then
Sure.
we should
It's a great
probably call it. Yeah. So have there been any studies looking at asthma and microplastic association?
Yeah, so the textile example that I provided mentioned higher rates of those types of respiratory ailments like asthma related to that. And I think that has to do with just particle inhalation in general. Yeah, as far as that goes.
Great.
Hand washing better than machine washing? That's a fantastic question too. I don't know. But I do know what scientists have looked at is that if you use a fabric softener and if you use cold water and put more laundry in it, that those things help reduce the number of fibers that are shed. But I don't know about hand washing, probably because it's a more challenging thing to do. So they're looking more at washing machine design to try to reduce that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kirsten. For those of you who may be new to Zoom, there's a little thing called reactions. So if you want to clap your hands or unmute yourself again and clap in person, really thank you for being here. And that was a great presentation, good questions.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic questions. And thank you for all the thank yous as well. And I appreciate your interest and I encourage you to get involved. And yeah, Suki has my contact information. So if you have any other questions, feel free to send it through her perhaps. And
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. And if any of you in the Yakima community are interested in climate and environment issues, our club meets on Tuesdays at 12:30 in Zoom until further notice, but you're all welcome to attend. So yeah, just get in touch with one of us. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great evening.
Seems like a great club to be involved in. So keep up the good work.